She wasn't supposed to be there. That was the thought that broke Ethan Caldwell. Not the champagne flutes catching the late afternoon sun. Not the 100 guests murmuring his name like a prayer. Not even the diamond ring that had cost him more than his first apartment. It was her. Standing at the waterline with the Pacific curling around her bare feet, wearing a white linen dress like she owned the ocean itself, looking at him with eyes that held no anger, no hunger, no desperation, just the quiet, devastating calm of a woman who had already won. But it wasn't Zola that made his blood drain from his face. It was the two boys standing beside her. They were maybe 5, 6 years old. One of them was pointing at a pelican skimming the surf. The other had turned around, and when his eyes found Ethan's across 20 feet of sand and stunned silence, the child tilted his head the way children do when something confuses them. Slow, curious, innocent, and said in a voice that somehow cut through every conversation, every laugh track, every curated moment of the engagement party around them. "Mommy, why does that man look like us?" The champagne glass slipped in Ethan's hand. Charlotte caught it. "Ethan," she said, squeezing his arm. "Baby, what's wrong?" He couldn't answer. He couldn't move. His lungs had simply stopped cooperating. 7 years. 7 years of building walls and filing paperwork and telling himself it was the right thing to do, the necessary thing, the only thing that could have saved the company, saved his reputation, saved the version of himself that the world had decided was worth something. 7 years of convincing himself that what he'd felt for Zola Adeyemi was a chapter, not the whole story. And now she was standing 20 feet away on his private beach at his engagement party, and the two small boys beside her had his jaw, his nose, his gray-blue eyes, and one of them was looking at him like he was a puzzle. Ethan Caldwell had survived hostile acquisitions, Senate hearings, and a near-company collapse. He had never, not once, turned pale in public. Until now. 7 years before that afternoon, Ethan had been nobody worth photographing. He was 31, brilliant, arrogant in the specific way that only self-made men can be. The kind of arrogance that reads as confidence until it costs you everything. He'd founded Caldwell Technologies on a series of algorithmic payment systems and a borderless digital banking concept that most investors thought was a decade ahead of its time. He was right. They were wrong. And he was just beginning to understand the distance between being right and being powerful. He met Zola at a financial innovation summit in New York. She was 28, a Nigerian graduate student from Lagos, completing her doctorate in global finance at Columbia. And she was standing at the edge of a panel discussion about fintech penetration in emerging markets, arms crossed, expression tight, clearly unimpressed. "You disagree with something," he said, stepping beside her. She glanced at him once. "Everything the man just said about West African banking infrastructure is 5 years out of date. He's the keynote speaker. He's also wrong." Ethan had smiled. He wasn't used to people who didn't know his name being more certain in a room than he was. "What's the correct version?" she told him. For 45 minutes, standing at the side of that conference hall, with untouched glasses of sparkling water, she laid out a market analysis that was sharper than anything his own team had produced. She didn't flirt. She didn't perform. She simply knew, with that rare kind of knowing that had nothing to do with ego and everything to do with obsessive, relentless study. He called her the next day. She didn't answer. He called again. She returned the call 4 days later, said she'd been finishing a chapter of her dissertation, and asked if he was actually interested in the African expansion strategy they'd discussed, or if he was just looking for company. He hired her as a consultant. Within 3 months, she had negotiated him into 3 West African markets his board hadn't even flagged. Within 6 months, they were working 18-hour days side by side, Takeout containers and finance journals spread across his office floor, arguing about capital flow models, and occasionally, accidentally, about everything else. Books, families, fear, ambition, what they each believed the world owed them, and what they planned to take anyway. He told her he loved her on a Tuesday morning at 4 a.m., surrounded by spreadsheets, her hair pinned up with a pen, her glasses sliding down her nose. He hadn't planned it. It came out like a confession. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, very quietly, "That's going to complicate things." "I know," he said. "I'm not interested in being your interesting face," she told him, and her voice was steady, but her eyes weren't. "I've watched women like me get used as proof that a man has range. I'm not doing that. I'm not asking you to." "Then what are you asking?" "I'm asking you to marry me," he said, which stunned both of them, because he'd had no idea that was what he was going to say until it was already in the air between them. They married 3 months later, at a city courthouse with 2 witnesses, a bouquet from a corner bodega, and dinner afterward at the Nigerian restaurant in Brooklyn, where she'd taken him on what she'd refused to call a date, but clearly was. It was the happiest day of his life, and he knew it even then, which is rare. Most people only recognize the happiest days in the rearview mirror. The trouble started slowly, the way it always does with things that are going to be catastrophic. As Caldwell Technologies grew, as the valuation climbed, and the press coverage multiplied, Ethan's face started appearing on magazine covers. And Zola appeared in the background of those stories, described in ways that were careful but unmistakable. His Nigerian-born wife, the foreign consultant he married impulsively, a liability, sources say, in terms of optics. The board never said it directly. They were too sophisticated for that. But the comments arrived in layers, dressed in business language. Investor perception was a phrase that got used a lot. Brand alignment. The story we're telling. One board member, a man named Gerald Pierce, who wore the same Navy suit to every meeting and had the warmth of a parking garage, leaned across the conference table one afternoon and said, "The IPO is everything, Ethan. Everything around you needs to support that story. Everything." He'd looked at the man and said nothing, but he hadn't pushed back either. Then the leak happened. It was a Thursday. Ethan arrived at the office to a conference room full of pale-faced executives and lawyers, the company's lead counsel sliding a folder across the table with the expression of a man delivering a terminal diagnosis. The international expansion strategy, the full document, including projected acquisition targets in 3 African nations, had been obtained by a rival firm. The leak had come from inside. Stock valuation had dropped 9 points overnight. 2 major institutional investors had called. The investigation pointed toward the Africa division. Zola's division. She had access. She had motive if you were willing to believe she had any. And the board, Ethan would later understand, had been looking for a reason to believe exactly that. Charlotte Whitmore arrived in his orbit precisely then, introduced by Gerald Pierce as a crisis communication specialist, the daughter of Senator Whitmore's top political donor, impeccably credentialed, impeccably positioned, impeccably convenient. She was everything the board meant when they said brand alignment. She was polished and connected, and she had never once challenged anyone in a conference room. The pressure on Ethan was constant, suffocating, delivered in the gentlest possible language by people who had a great deal to gain from his compliance. "Distance yourself," they said. "Just temporarily. Just for the IPO." We're not saying she did anything wrong. We're saying perception is reality. He chose wrong. The divorce papers were filed on a morning in March. Ethan told himself he'd explain later, that he'd call her after, that it was temporary, that once the IPO closed, he would fix it. He told himself these things because the alternative, Admitting that he had traded the best person he had ever known for a stock valuation was not something he was capable of looking at directly. Zola tried to reach him twice before the papers were finalized. He didn't take the calls. His assistant, following instructions, said he was unavailable. She had been trying to tell him she was pregnant. She left for Lagos 6 days after the divorce was finalized. She left, quietly, the way people leave when they've accepted that no one is coming to stop them. She didn't call again. She didn't send word. She simply disappeared from his life with a completeness that should have told him something. That a woman who disappears that cleanly is not hiding. She is rebuilding. Lagos received her like a homecoming. Her mother cried. Her father said nothing, which from him was the highest form of pride. She found a small apartment near the university, near her family, near the markets she'd written her dissertation about, and she sat with the fact of her pregnancy and made the only decision that made sense. She would raise her children in truth and power, and she would not spend a single day waiting for Ethan Caldwell to become who she'd once believed he was. She named the twins Caleb and Elijah. Family names, names that carried weight. She launched Adeyemi Logistics the following year, a fintech logistics hybrid that targeted the bottleneck between West African small-scale manufacturers and American retail supply chains. The model was exactly what she'd outlined to Ethan at that conference in New York, the conversation that had started everything. She built it without him. She funded the first round herself, the second through a Lagos-based angel network, and the third through a Singapore firm that recognized in her pitch deck the kind of precision that only comes from someone who has survived being underestimated. She also, in her quieter hours, investigated the IPO leak. She had never believed it was her, obviously, but she also knew that whoever had done it had used her access as a shield, and she wanted to understand how. She hired a cybersecurity firm in Johannesburg. It took 14 months, but the IP trail, buried under 3 layers of proxies and a shell company registered in the Cayman Islands, eventually led back to a private server, one that belonged to a firm called Whitmore Capital Partners, Charlotte's father. Zola sat with that information for 2 years. She didn't go to the press. She didn't contact Ethan. She didn't do anything except build her company, raise her sons, and wait for the moment when the information would do the most good, which is to say, the moment when she no longer needed it for anything except justice. That moment was the afternoon of Ethan's engagement party. She hadn't come to confront him. She and the twins were staying at a friend's property 2 miles up the coast, and the beach was public access below the tide line. She had known about the party. It had been live-streamed, announced, hashtagged into every corner of social media, and she had considered avoiding the beach entirely. But Caleb had wanted to see the ocean. He'd never been to the Pacific, and Zola had decided, standing in her friend's kitchen that morning, with the California sun already bright through the window, that she was done rearranging her life around Ethan Caldwell's calendar. So she brought her sons to the beach. And Caleb, being Caleb, curious and direct in the way of children who have been raised without apology, had looked up at the pale man in the expensive linen shirt and asked the question out loud that everyone within earshot was suddenly, frantically thinking. When Ethan finally moved, it was toward them. Charlotte grabbed his arm. "Ethan, the photographers are watching. Whatever this is, you need to wait." "Let go of my arm," he said, and his voice was so quiet and so certain that she did. He crossed the sand. The party noise faded behind him as guests turned and whispered, and someone somewhere pointed a phone. He stopped in front of Zola and the boys, and for a long moment he said absolutely nothing. He looked at the children. He looked at their faces. He was doing the math that every cell in his body had already finished. "What are their names?" he asked. "Caleb," Zola said calmly, "and Elijah." The names hit him physically. He'd had a grandfather named Caleb, an uncle named Elijah. She'd remembered. In the middle of everything he'd put her through, she had given their sons his family's names. "You were pregnant," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." "When you tried to call me?" "Yes." "Zola, you made your choice, Ethan," she said, and there was no cruelty in it, which somehow made it worse. "I made mine." Caleb tugged her hand. "Mommy, who is this?" She looked down at her son, then back up at Ethan, giving him nothing. No rescue, no cue, no direction. Whatever he said next was entirely his own. Ethan crouched down to the boy's level. His throat was working hard. He stopped, started again. "I knew your mother, a long time ago." Elijah, who had been watching from slightly behind his brother, took one careful step forward and studied Ethan's face with extraordinary focus for a 6-year-old. "You look sad," he said. Ethan pressed his lips together. His eyes were bright. "I am," he said. "I'm very sad." Behind them, Charlotte had reached the edge of the crowd. Ethan heard her voice cutting through the murmur. "It's fine, everyone. It's a business acquaintance, please. The photographer is—" But even she couldn't sustain the performance, because at that exact moment, every phone on the beach began buzzing. A financial alert. Breaking. Scrolling across screens in the golden California light. Adeyemi Logistics had just acquired 22% of Vertex Global, Caldwell Technology's largest competitor, in a deal valued at $1.4 billion, making Zola Adeyemi, effective immediately, one of the most significant players in the sector her ex-husband had once dominated alone. The gasps were audible. Someone said her name. Someone else Googled it. Within 90 seconds, the party had transformed from an engagement celebration into something between a press conference and a crime scene. Charlotte's phone rang. She looked at the screen. Her face changed. Then the second wave hit. An encrypted data package had been delivered simultaneously to 7 members of Ethan's board of directors, 2 financial journalists, and the offices of the Securities and Exchange Commission. It contained 847 pages of documentation. Server logs, financial transfers, internal communications, and a forensic cybersecurity report tracing the original IPO leak to Whitmore Capital Partners, and specifically to a server authorized by Charlotte's father, Robert Whitmore, in coordination with a board member named Gerald Pierce, who had stood to profit substantially from the company's valuation collapse before a timed reinvestment. Zola had not sent it herself. She had instructed her lawyers to send it on a timer. She hadn't wanted to be holding her phone when it landed. Federal agents, already positioned, already briefed, because Zola's legal team had been working with the SEC for 4 months, appeared at the periphery of the party with the quiet efficiency of people who have rehearsed this moment many times. Robert Whitmore, who had arrived an hour earlier to toast his daughter's engagement, was escorted off the beach with a hand on his elbow and the cameras of 100 live-streaming guests following every step. Charlotte screamed at Ethan, "You need to fix this. Call your lawyers. Call someone. My father didn't. This is fabricated. This is her doing this. She's been planning this." "Has she?" Ethan said. And the way he said it, not angry, not defensive, just exhausted and clear-eyed, told Charlotte everything she needed to know about which direction he was going to fall. "She destroyed us," Charlotte said, her voice dropping into something raw and desperate. "She destroyed everything we built." "We built?" Ethan looked at her. "Charlotte, your father destroyed my marriage. He used my wife as a cover story. And His voice broke slightly. "I let him. I handed him the opportunity and I walked away when she tried to tell me something was wrong." He shook his head. "She didn't destroy anything. She just turned the lights on." Charlotte left. She walked off that beach with her heels in her hand, and her PR instincts already activating, already calculating the statement, the reframe, the counter-narrative. But there was no counter-narrative for 847 pages of documentation and a father in federal custody. The party dissolved around Ethan like a stage set being struck. Caterers packed up. Guests drifted. The photographer stopped shooting. The live stream cut. And then it was just the beach, and the waves, and Ethan standing a few feet from Zola, while the twins chased the tide line in the fading light, unaware and unbothered, and completely, maddeningly happy. "I need you to understand something," Ethan said. "I don't need anything from you," she replied. I know that. But I need to say it anyway." He turned to face her fully. I loved you, and I convinced myself that what I was doing was temporary, that I would fix it, that you would still be there when I got around to being the person you deserved. And you weren't. Because you don't wait for people who've already shown you who they are." Zola was quiet for a moment. The sun was getting low. "I don't want an apology, Ethan." "I know. I want you to be their father," she said. "Not a presence, not a headline, not a man who shows up at birthdays and thinks that constitutes parenting. If you want to be in their lives, you show up consistently. You call. You come to Lagos. You learn who they are." She paused. "And you understand that being their father has absolutely nothing to do with you and me." "I understand," he said. "I don't think you do yet," she said, not unkindly. "But you might." Caleb ran back up the sand and crashed into Zola's legs, breathless, pointing at something in the water. She caught him automatically, steadied him, and looked down at him with the particular expression of a mother who is also somehow entirely herself, not swallowed by the role but expanded by it. Elijah stopped a few feet from Ethan. He looked up at him with those impossible gray-blue eyes. "Are you going to come visit us?" he asked. Ethan crouched down. His voice was very careful. "Would that be okay with you?" Elijah considered this with the gravity of someone processing a major policy decision. "You can come," he said finally, "but you have to bring Chin-Chin. Grandma says you can tell if someone is serious by whether they learn what you like." Despite everything, the collapsed engagement, the federal agents, the 7 years, the grief that was just beginning to find its shape in his chest, Ethan almost smiled. "Chin-Chin," he said. "Got it." The next morning, the headlines were everything the party had been promised to be, and nothing like what anyone had planned. Ethan's face was on every financial news site. The story had everything: billionaire, betrayal, secret twins, corporate sabotage, a Nigerian CEO who had quietly assembled a billion-dollar empire while the man who had abandoned her posed for magazine covers. Social media had decided Zola was a hero before the sun came up. The comment sections were full of people who had watched the live stream freeze mid-proposal and spent the night piecing together what had happened. At 10 o'clock, Ethan called a press conference. He didn't do damage control. He stood in front of the cameras with no prepared statement, no PR handler, no carefully worded non-apology, and he said in full that he had 2 sons he had not known about until the previous afternoon because he had refused to take a phone call from their mother 7 years ago, that he had failed in his marriage by choosing reputation over integrity, that the IPO leak that had been blamed implicitly on his ex-wife had in fact originated from within his own inner circle, enabled by people he had trusted, that he was cooperating fully with the SEC investigation, that his board would be restructured. And then he said, "I have 2 boys named Caleb and Elijah, and I'm going to spend whatever time they'll give me proving I'm worth knowing." He answered 3 questions. Then he walked off the stage. Zola was already on her yacht when the press conference aired on the cabin screen. She watched it with her coffee going cold in her hand, and she felt not satisfaction, not vindication, not the particular warmth of being publicly proven right. What she felt was something quieter and more complete than any of that. She felt finished, the way you feel when you've set down something very heavy that you'd been carrying so long you'd stopped noticing the weight. Caleb was at the table drawing. Elijah was in the sleeping cabin reading a book about ocean animals that he'd found in the yacht's small library. The boat was moving, and the California coast was becoming something you could only see if you looked behind you. Her phone had more notifications than she would read that day, or possibly that week. Her company's stock had opened 4% higher. 3 major journalists had requested interviews. A senator's office had called about a trade infrastructure testimony. A private equity firm in London had sent a message that began, "We've been watching your work for 2 years, and we think it's time." She set the phone face down. Caleb looked up from his drawing. "Mommy, are we going home?" "We're going home," she said. "Is that man going to come to Lagos?" She looked at her son, his face, so careful, so searching. "I think he'll try," she said. "We'll see if he does." Caleb nodded, apparently satisfied with the honesty of that, and went back to his drawing. Zola stood at the stern of the yacht and watched Malibu recede. She had spent a long time imagining what this moment would feel like. Not the confrontation, not the exposure, not even the acquisition announcement. Just this. Leaving. On her own terms. With her children. With a company she had built from nothing on a continent that had welcomed her back when she had nothing left. Toward a future that she had constructed line by line, decision by decision, without anyone's permission. Back on the shore, Ethan stood at the edge of his empty beach estate. The party furniture was still being packed up. The champagne flutes had been collected. The flowers were wilting in the warm air. He watched the yacht until it was small enough to mistake for something else. He had a meeting with his restructured board in the morning. He had calls to make, lawyers to speak with, damage to map. He had the long, uncomfortable work of becoming someone his sons might one day respect. He had no idea if Zola would ever look at him as anything other than a cautionary tale. And he had decided that was not the point. The point was simpler and harder than that. The point was chin-chin. The point was showing up. The point was learning what they liked. He pulled out his phone and searched. Best chin-chin bakeries in Lagos. Then he booked a flight. She didn't return for revenge. She didn't return to reclaim him, or to collapse him, or even to show him what he had lost, though she had done all of those things simply by existing, by thriving, by walking onto that beach with 2 small boys who looked exactly like him and exactly like her, and were entirely their own people. She returned because the Pacific coast was beautiful, and her son wanted to see the ocean. She returned because she was no longer the woman who had once built her schedule around his. She returned because she could. And when the yacht disappeared past the horizon and the last of the sun went with it, the beach was quiet, and the only thing left of Zola Adeyemi was a set of footprints in the wet sand at the waterline, already filling with water, already becoming the oceans again. The world would spend weeks talking about that beach, the collapsed engagement, the secret twins, the corporate conspiracy cracked open by a woman who had chosen to build rather than burn. They would write long articles and produce short videos and argue in comment sections about who was the real villain and whether Ethan deserved redemption and what Zola's face meant when she'd watched him kneel in the sand in front of her sons. But Zola herself would give exactly one interview about it, 6 months later, from her office in Lagos, with the city visible behind her, and a photograph of Caleb and Elijah on her desk. The journalist would ask her what she wanted people to take away from the story. Zola would think about it for a moment, genuinely think, not perform thinking, and then she would say, I want them to understand that walking away quietly is not the same as losing. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to need someone, and then go build something they'll read about. Then she would smile, thank the journalist, and go pick up her sons from school. If this story moved you, shook you, or had you holding your breath at that beach scene, you are not alone. And that means this channel is doing exactly what it should. Hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss a story like this one. Drop a comment below and tell us, was Zola right to walk away, or should she have given Ethan a second chance? We read every single one, and if you liked this video, please tap that like button. It takes 2 seconds, and it helps more people find stories worth their time. We'll see you in the next one.